As George so gracefully introduced us as, Will and I were both from the University of Washington, and we're telling you about today a uProxy, which is a browser extension, which we hope will make it easier for you to be able to proxy internet traffic for your friends and family. But let me try to motivate the problem a little bit. I think one of the things that I want you to take away from this is that, I firmly believe that users need more control over the path that they take on the internet. So the internet, is a very pretty graphic, but all I'm trying to say here is that the internet is a very highly interconnected space. But one thing that's been true since the beginning is that when a user tries to access a website, the path that they take over however many hops it takes to get there, they have actually no control over that path. So what that means is that if you're a malicious actor somewhere in the network, if you are well placed, there's a lot of power in what you can do. You can monitor what the users are doing, you can surveil them, you can censor them, you might even be able to attack them, depending on what type of network traffic it is. And so while there are tools that try to address this in different ways, I believe as a community we need to drastically lower the bar so that even the most basic user can A, reason about what's happening, and B, have the tools so that they can try to route around otherwise disrupted sites. So uProxy is a step towards that goal. It's a Chrome and Firefox extension that we're building, soon to be released on the web store, that essentially it exposes a contact list, much like you would expect in a web app. You'll get this list after you log into, say, Google or Facebook, and we provide some nice UX to make it easy for you to request access through friend, provide some way to share that kind of consent back through the network. Yes. And ultimately, what it'll provide is a encrypted tunnel between you and your friend, between your two browsers, that you can route your traffic through to be able to request to see the internet basically from their point of view. So to some extent, it's as if your machine was teleported onto the same Wi-Fi network as them, and you're seeing the internet from their point of view. And one of the things that we want to focus on here is actually a strong focus on usability. As a network student, I feel like I can say that hasn't been something that I have put very much focus in the past, and something that desperately we need to be able to convey to normal users is how to use the software. So let's take a quick step back and ask ourselves why we might need something like this. Back in 2010, a tool that I very much enjoyed playing with was something called Firesheet. And if you've never used it before, it was actually a lot of fun. I don't encourage you to attack anybody, but basically what it meant was that it was a tool that you can install onto your Firefox browser, sit in a coffee shop somewhere, and basically if anybody was accessing sites over unencrypted HTTP, you can extract their cookies and go back later and log in as them. And at that time, Facebook was something that wasn't over HTTPS, and you could very easily just log in as that other user and send messages and whatnot. Now, this might seem like a cute little toy, but let's fast forward 3 years later, and now we know that that same spirit of vulnerability means that we have nation states with a large number of resources using that same vulnerability to be able to monitor and track basically entire populations of the world. And while what this essentially points to the fact that is that universal encryption doesn't exist yet. It didn't exist pre-Snowden days. There was a report from Sandvine that I think said 2.29% of North American peak network traffic was encrypted back then, so not very much. And you'd think that with all the hubbub and all the press that came out after the Snowden leaks that there'd be a lot more, but I think that number as of this year jumped to 3.8. So I think we still have a long way to go. Unencrypted traffic is here to stay. So that a network adversary has quite a bit of power.
Yeah. Did you know that this week the Internet Architecture Board made a statement calling for encryption end-to-end everywhere?
That sounds great. I would love to see that happen. And it's hard to talk about network destruction without talking about censorship. And it's hard to emphasize how hard this is. To some extent, mostly because we live in a country where we don't see as much of this as other people do in other places of the world. But this is a screenshot from Iran, I believe, where you might try to access something as simple as Wikipedia, just try to get knowledge about something and not be able to access it. I don't want to hammer into that too much, but one of the things that we do know is that censorship is not getting better. So a report that came out of Freedom House in 2013 shows that about 19 countries now do some kind of blocking of social media or communications tools, like very basic communications tools. And we're up to actually 29 countries now that do some kind of network disruption based on social, political, or religious content. So, clearly we're in the green here relative to a lot of the rest of the world, but just imagine living in one of those countries where you're trying to get access to news on something that happened and can't see what the truth is.
Cool. So one of the questions that's we're sort of, I guess maybe helps understand where we're coming from is why now? Why is this, there are other proxies that exist. What's new here? What is the, excitement? I think there's a couple things. The first is that we've sort of entered an age where we have this sense of identity that is more than just like the device. The first round of proxies, the ones that exist, what the sense of like how you were connecting was you were connecting to some computer and you would have to identify this computer, and that was a pretty hard thing to do, and was relatively technical for a lot of people. And so we're trying to say, with uProxy, can we sort of remove that, make you not have to think about that so much, and instead think about the friends and the actual like people that you know as the way that you're going to get access. So instead of having to type in some computer's address, I'm going to connect with Facebook or with my email address or some additional contact network, and we're going to try and use that as the basis for these links that we're going to send our traffic over. And hopefully that lets us reach a whole new sort of set of users who had trouble with the concept of where am I sending this and what are these internet paths. The second thing is we've got the web, and it's really been advancing to a point where we can do this in browser, which means that this is a thing that's going to run in Chrome and in Firefox rather than being a separate app to install. Hopefully that means we can get the installation process to be a little bit simpler and less scary and require less permissions. It also means that we're able to write this code once and have it work on all of these environments. And that's sort of been enabled because the web has grown to the point where within the web browser you can form a direct connection to someone else's machine. And we've got APIs now where we can actually make network connections from these extensions so that we can do the technical stuff that we need to do a proxy like this. So we've sort of got another chance at this point. And so I guess the other thing is what is a proxy and what is different about this model. You've got your internet connection, and the problem that I think Ray was talking about earlier, right, is you've got someone in your local network or in the network you're in, the coffee shop or the country or the ISP, who's able to see all the traffic that you're sending out. They can see where it's going. They can look at the traffic and monitor it. And you really can't control that, right? You can't avoid whatever this ISP is. You're stuck in there. And so they can discriminate, and we would like to make that harder. And so what a proxy does is you'll have some proxy server that's outside of this network, and all of your traffic to YouTube and to not YouTube and to whatever sites all goes first to your proxy, and then it goes out to the final destinations. And so that makes the job of this guy here quite a bit harder. All of your traffic, you're no longer using the red things, you're going everything through those blue lines. And what that means is that they can either block everything or they can block nothing. They can't block the specific sites that they're after. And hopefully this connection to this blue thing is encrypted so that they can't actually see inside and see the specific things that you're saying, right? They only see that you are sending traffic to this. But we still have some issues with decentralized things. One is that there is a game of sort of cat and mouse that has played out repeatedly, which is that, someone starts up a proxy server, it gets more and more popular. Whoever it is who's, wants to monitor the traffic notices that this is not something that is useful or something they don't want. It lets them, no longer monitor people in their network. And so they block access to the proxy server. And so a new one starts up somewhere else, and that repeats. And the other thing is you have to trust this proxy server. It now sees all of your traffic. And so it can do the same fire sheep examples. It can do the same attacks. And so there's a ton of these sort of one-hop proxies that they get called. that you can pay for access, and you don't really necessarily know who these people are that are running these things, and so they can be just as dangerous as the network itself. And you see this a lot. There's been a lot of attacks on people, especially the activists who are motivated to use these proxies. They'll get attacked by using unsafe ones. So instead, I guess the new idea, the core of this is we don't want to use one proxy server. We want you to each person should be using a friend that they already trust, because now you've got someone over here you trust. So we've solved that problem, right? If you're using a relative or a close friend, you're probably more willing to believe that they aren't going to like spy on your traffic or block parts of it than someone you don't know at all. And it makes this guy's job a little bit harder, because even as this scales, as more people start using this, there's no single friend who they block. It's a lot of connections to a lot of different places. And so as long as we can make that traffic, not stand out too much, it makes this guy's job pretty hard to like stop people from using it. So we think that this is a way that we can actually scale this up, make it something that people, are going to see as something that's more common and get some visibility around it, while it's still possible to keep growing. At the same time, there's a bunch of things that this doesn't. One is that this does not give you anonymity, right? Your connection appears to be coming from your friend, and we're not going to try and claim in any way that you are anonymous or hidden. Your friend is responsible for your access. Part of this like giving access to someone is like you're responsible for what they do over your internet connection. And so this isn't Tor, and we don't want to like claim in any way that it is. Right? And for that matter, this can totally be used with Tor as the first step, the first hop. And Tor is working with a bunch of people to do that sort of stuff. So, and it's possible that you end up connecting to a less safe network, right? Like there's issues of like, well, maybe your friend has an open wireless network and their network's being spied on. So this isn't like a silver bullet, right? But it definitely, there's a big class of people, and sort of like a large class of people who we think have not been previously targeted or had a useful opportunity or a good option for making their networks more secure, that this is able to help. Cool. And I guess maybe one other point is like, what are the use cases that we think are really important with it? There's a lot beyond just getting access when your internet connection has issues. If you're traveling to a coffee shop or something, this is a way for you to stay secure on your home network. If someone else is, saying that they can't access something, you can, as the tech support person, go in and like figure out why. So there's some other side benefits to having something like this that's really easy to use. So we have some examples of what this is going to look like that I can like help step through, and then we can sort of talk about more of a discussion around this. The goal with a lot of this is sort of, can we make this like something that's really understandable and not too scary, while still being somewhat accurate about like what it actually does, right? So you're going to install, you get a nice little pop-up in your browser. You can choose which of your existing social networks you want to connect to. We're going to have support for Google and Facebook initially, but we've also got an API that we're hoping we can work with other people to build in a bunch more social networks. So we've got a fairly simple thing and a nice path for third-party developers to come in and say, we want to add support for whatever network is popular. And then you get your list of contacts, and you get to get access or share access. And so, yeah, from there, you can ask for access. This will send a message over the network. If the person doesn't have the application installed, it will ask them to install it. Otherwise, it will say, one of your friends is requesting access. They can accept that. And at that point, you can start getting access. You get to start and stop. And when you are started, all of your internet traffic from that browser will go through your friend before going out to the internet. Likewise, as important for the person who's sharing, they can stop sharing access if they, need to use their computer for something else, or if they no longer trust you or realize they've made a mistake using all of your input. You've got some settings. A lot of this is, it's not a hugely complex app. I guess that maybe is hopefully not too scary. if you've got comments, that would be great. Internally.
Yeah, they're like,
I don't know.
Tell me if you want me to go any slower, but this slide's mostly for the technical people who are interested in how it works. All of it's open source, so it's open audit at any given time, and you're welcome to play with it, contribute, give us comments. We're all on GitHub. But at a high level, if there's 2 users, Alice and Bob, basically what's happening is you're connecting to these social networks, and there's a number of things that the social networks provide. You're not actually sending any of your traffic through the social network. It's just a mechanism to discover who your friends are, potentially send signaling messages to be able to set up a peer-to-peer connection. And ultimately what happens is, like, when Alice wants to proxy through Bob, you'll connect to the social network, you'll discover that Bob is there and he's online. You'll use this channel as a mechanism to set up the actual peer-to-peer channel. And at this point, we're using a web standard called WebRTC. Not to go too much into the details, but it will provide you with an encrypted channel. It will allow you to do what's called NAT traversal, which essentially is, how do you get a peer-to-peer connection between two devices that are behind like a home firewall or something like that, which may use some protocols such as stun, but again, those are the details that aren't all too important. Aside from the fact that it makes it work, but and we're also working on what we're calling obfuscated WebRTC. So that essentially allows us as the developer to be able to manipulate the traffic on the wire so that it looks like something else. So that us as uProxy or even as the developer, or even as the user, the WebRTC traffic goes through an obfuscating protocol, which allows us to say, do we want this traffic to look like normal HTTP traffic or look like something else, depending on what region you're in and what types of filters that they have. And then once that peer-to-peer connection is set up, then we've essentially written a SOX 5 proxy that actually is entirely in JavaScript that you can direct your web browser settings to, which our extension does automatically, so that all requests actually go out through Bob before it actually comes back to your machine. As Will was mentioning a little bit earlier, we're working to make this very modular in a very plugin based way so that any developer can come in and add support for another social network, a different transport mechanism. Say we don't want to use WebRTC, we want to make it look like, some other type of traffic. We're adding support to make that very easy for third-party developers. I think what Will touched on earlier is that, we're basically trying to make this software as generic as possible. We're just trying to make it, we're just playing with the experiment of what happens when we make it trivially easy for anybody to install a proxy server. What can we do with that? There's a number of cases where you can imagine it might even be useful for us where, maybe we're not living in a world where we're not living in a country where we have to deal with censorship quite as much. Perhaps you're going to be traveling to one at some point. Perhaps you're in a coffee shop where it's unencrypted Wi-Fi and they're going to be snooping on you and you want to proxy back home first. And so it's really just supposed to be a pretty simple primitive that people can grasp.
Cool. Okay, so we're working on this. Hopefully we'll get to something that's released very soon. It is open source. You can build it yourself, but right now, as we sort of keep working on it, we're waiting until we have something where we feel is like really stable and like is going to be a good user experience before we make it easy to get. So right now, it takes some technical chops to like get your own version going, and that's on purpose. But that's the plan. We've got a bunch of like things that we know we want to do with it. We want to get a mobile version at some point because more and more of the world is using mobile. We'd also like to make it really easy for you to be able to set up some version on a cloud, on a server you control somewhere, and be able to go to another machine that you control.
So in other words, you wouldn't have to rely on another client, desktop, or mobile. You could actually run it as a service.
Right. Exactly.
Among your friends or whatever else.
Right. So that's sort of where we're going. There's a website. There's the source there, and it would be great to like hear what you guys have to say about it, and where we go, things of that nature. Thank you.
Cool. Are there any questions, or do we just explain that so damn well?
How identifiable is WebRTC traffic, obfuscated or not?
So it's UDP based, right, as opposed to TCP, and it's sort of this standard thing called DTLS, which is a datagram TLS stream. And so that isn't just WebRTC that looks like that looks like this DTLS thing. And what that means is you get something that looks very much like a TLS handshake, followed by just encrypted stuff
It could
afterwards.
be VoIP or something.
Right. So there are other VoIP things that use something that looks very similar in that nature. The actual, like the thing that we're most worried about is the initial handshake of setting up this peer-to-peer connection. That's going to look more like, you know, the way browsers do it is probably different from how Skype is going to do it, for instance. So we're going to need to be careful about making sure that that isn't too identifiable, but the actual transport itself is going to look just sort of like random UDP packets. And that should be good for a while until, you know, someone decides to turn off all of UDP, which hopefully won't happen. Yeah.
Do I understand correctly? I open up my laptop, I go to Facebook, and I didn't quite comprehend how I'm using another person's laptop in the room to communicate. Could you just
Yeah, absolutely.
simple?
Yeah, we can slow this down a little bit. I mean, it's not necessarily that you're going to Facebook.com first. I mean, I think there was just only one screen where we kind of like alluded to this, but there'll be a little button after you install this browser extension that'll pop up on your, you know, I don't know what this bar is for. Left.
Yes, extension on the Firefox.
In both Firefox
both
and
Chrome.
Chrome, we have.
And then once you've clicked on that, then we have this full user flow of this way. You know, it'll be an introductory screen that explains to you what's happening. You can log in. You'll log in through the extension. We use OAuth, so it's actually, you know, delegated authentication. And then this screen is essentially that little pop-up that will show up once you click the button, right? So that'll be a separate UI, but it'll hopefully be, you know, somewhat familiar in terms of what you're expecting. It's like a buddy list. You can request access, you can approve of access, and there'll be a giant start button. And once you hit start, you know, hopefully it'll be obvious that your browser traffic is all going through your friend before it actually goes out on the internet.
So basically, I would be communicating with somebody whose face is somebody who's up on the list,
Yep.
as opposed to doing other Facebook kind of things. Is that
Well, let's say
So you don't ever go to Facebook.com.
you never do?
No.
That's
So you
all-
install
Go ahead.
you install the extension.
Right.
You say, I want to log into Facebook to use my Facebook friends.
All right.
That will open up a Facebook page that asks you for your password to allow us to get access to your Facebook friends. But then back in that add-on, in the Firefox extension, that's where you choose your friend and get access. You don't do that on the Facebook website.
Think of it as like if people don't go to my PC, right, or you know, remote desktop and things like that, and you're accessing through another person's computer. So you're using their computer as a doorway, and you're then using their bandwidth.
Right.
But instead of installing Go to My PC and then installing Go to My PC, you're putting uProxy on the desktop, on your local computer, and they're also installing it on their computer.
I mean, something we haven't said explicitly yet is, you know, presumably once you've set up this connection, then you use your browser as normal, right? You're entering sites into your bar, you're accessing different sites that may or may not be blocked, and you're essentially accessing the internet as if you were like sitting next to your friend.
So the mention of Facebook is because we're using the bandwidth of the people who are on Facebook in the local area.
Facebook is one of the ways to find the friends that you want to use bandwidth.
Okay.
You don't
There's
have to
other
use
ways,
Facebook.
obviously.
You can send them emails to set up that connection. We're going to have a Google Plus one, and we'll have an API for people to build their own.
All right, so they're okaying it at some point. They're saying,
Yes,
yeah,
they
yeah.
have to okay it. So there's this, you know, accept or ignore screen, and there's a consent protocol that they have to.
So both people
They have
would
to-
have to install the extension.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, repeat that.
Both people have to install the extension. And
Gotcha.
so they get your request and they have to confirm.
Have you tried this out in the wild yet?
Working on it.
Like brought a computer to China or anything?
So like internally, we've like tested it among our group, but we don't have real users in China yet. So that's sort of like this first step. That's why it isn't released yet. It's like we think it's important to like do some of those user studies and feel pretty confident that it will work before we get
I think the OpenNet initiative, maybe University of Toronto had something like this a few years ago, but it was really technically difficult to set up. And I'll mostly be bogged. People in other countries will be asking me as a friend if they can go through. But if my computer's off, it's nothing good, right?
Mhm.
So time zones become very important.
Did you?
Yeah. So if you have multiple friends, do you load balance between them, or weight your friends based on how much?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, as of right now, everything's just going through one friend, and it's hard enough to convey that, as you probably can tell.
Yeah.
You know, in the future, you might want to experiment with magic that does multipath or something, but that's we're not even considering that yet.
Is it well supported, or is it planned to be supported to allow users to use their own proxies? For example, I might have two browsers running on separate computers, one on a computer at home, one on a laptop in some network that has filters in place.
Yeah.
Does that work already, or is it planned?
I mean, it is absolutely planned that we should be able to support that, right? So it's the case that we're going to have multiple devices. As of right now, if you download it and you try to install it right now, it may or may not work, but that's something that's really important.
You should be able to use your own.
You have multiple devices. You have a desktop at home, and you might want to deploy a cloud instance or something. But at the end of the day, I find that if I'm traveling around the country and I'm going to coffee shops and I don't necessarily trust that unencrypted Wi-Fi, it's still useful to me to proxy to a machine that I have.
Sorry, I joined a bit late, so you may have answered this question already. And I keep asking George questions because he's right there. And the answer is always depends on the threat model. Because I keep asking about the security issues. Who was your end user you had in mind when you were designing this? And has that changed? Who is this for? And what situations is this ideal for?
That's a really good question. I can tell you what it was motivated by, right? And it was clearly motivated by areas of censorship, where we know that people are actively blocking news and they need to get access to news or something. And most of these people are going to be people that know how to use websites, know how to use the browser, but don't necessarily are not technical experts by any means, right? And so to some extent, we try to make it as easily consumable as possible to anybody. Now, we've expanded our scope in our motivation quite a bit in terms of, well, it can still be useful for us, in the Western world for a variety of reasons, mostly because, the internet is not secure as we'd like it to be. But yes, it's certainly targeted towards people who need it more,
Are you planning on adding some sort of rating or evaluation criteria for various connections? So I think this ties into who your end user is, but just because I'm Facebook friends with them doesn't mean that their connection is necessarily secure. Like they may be at a coffee shop and I might want to connect to their connection. So is there a plan to kind of add that type of rating at some point?
That's probably going to be a little bit further down the line, is my guess. We will probably pretty early try and give you some sense of what country the person's device is in, because we can have that database and just know from an IP address basically what country it's in, so we can give you some sense of where they're likely to be. But actually, understanding are they in a coffee shop or not is going to be a little bit harder for us to say.
Presumably you could chat them or something else and find out.
Yeah, you can ask them if they're.
If you don't trust them, then chatting them doesn't seem to resolve the problem. Well, if you don't trust them, you shouldn't be using them. You don't want to. But yes.
We had a discussion earlier about this, but the difference between this model and then say trusting a DuckDuckGo or a proxy service through a search engine or anything like that is that ultimately you're really trusting your friend. What we call a pre-existing trust network. So you could sit there, you could be in one country, your cousin, your friend, whoever could be in another, and you could actually be relying on them to really play a service provider role. Now, it comes to context. I actually think of dozens of contexts where this would work. Again, you're not, this isn't Tor. They're not trying to build a Tor and make an easy version of Tor. There's lots of services that are blocked by country. The Hulu thing. I think online gaming sites. You're in the US, online gaming sites. This is a way to bypass those blocks. I'm not recommending it. I'm not saying, but I mean, every country has its Thanks, Dave. Thanks, sir. It's on video. But I think specifically, when you really look at, I don't know a better term for it, but you look at essentially a splintering of the internet over the past 5 years in particular, in terms of what services are available per country, what's allowed, what's acceptable. The one part I hated about your presentation was that Freedom House map, which...
It gets overused.
Well, not only that, but it's horribly inaccurate. I mean, what Australia's doing right now, you know, what the US has been trying to do and is already doing. I mean, sorry, taking domain names and top-level domains fits into censorship also from around the world in servers. I mean, that's one of the things. So I think if you're looking at a context where all the geopolitical conflicts going around in the world start reflecting the internet as they are, I think this is an ideal tool to actually specifically bypass in a certain context. But it's not core.
I have
that can be the subtitle.
I have a question that applies to some of the tools. A lot of the tools have bad user experience, and I just want to hear a little bit about your tips and how do you do this, and any lessons that you can share.
I mean, there's basic user-driven design, which, like, to some extent, you know, when I was, you know, I'm still a networking student at UW, but, you know, for some of the other projects that we've done, we've never really taken that into account. Like, even simple things that, like, seem obvious now in terms of designing websites or web apps, like, you know, having surveys and seeing how, like, what people understand, what people don't. Engaging designers, engaging people who are not necessarily technical in the design of the product before you even, you know, before you even do it, that's been immensely helpful for us.
Have all the designers been volunteers? Like, I'm just curious the model also.
Yeah,
we were lucky in that we had Google provide a designer to do mocks for us and to do user research.
Can you talk a little more about the relationship with Google?
They are a very generous donor that helps Will and I, you know, survive at the University of Washington. Quite a few of them have been, you know, volunteering their time to help us out, which has been fantastic and a really great relationship.
We've got a few of them in the room.
Yeah, and you know, I'm sure you can talk to them one-on-one, and they can probably tell you a little bit more about what parts of it are interesting to them. But
can I add another question about the user experience really quickly?
Yeah, of course.
So the designer that you contacted, did this person have experience with these tools before? And if they didn't, like, what type of training or what type of, like, kind of...
Right, yeah, there's definitely like, there's a ramp up of like playing with a bunch of like the existing proxies out there to get a sense of what these are. And then also like through the various networks that we had, finding people who have used some of these before or are in positions where they'd want to use a proxy and having those conversations of like through some earlier iterations of these mocks of like walking through with them and like where are you getting confused, what terms are like working and not working. And just seeing those
directly address your point. I don't think she was like. I mean, she's not like a networking lab PhD student, so it's not like that in any means. There's certainly an educational ramp up of understanding the technical things that are happening. But once you do that, then it's a matter of like, well, you know, what you're trying to do with the user experience is like, well, within like a couple of seconds with like of one using the tool, do they kind of get it, as opposed to going through this like lecture that we kind of gave.
How many slides of intro do you have to do before you?
Exactly. So there's, you know, you're just trying to condense that as much as possible in the UX. Yeah, that's a great question.
I apologize for coming in late, so it's possible that you've already covered this. But I appreciate what you're trying to do, and I'm also interested in the hard problems.
Okay.
And I'm wondering, I feel like one of the hard problems with this sort of approach is how you handle identity management in the first place. Have you discussed how you deal with identity management?
So what do you mean by identity management?
I mean, you've got a very nice picture over there that looks like it's your friend, a list of your friends.
Mm-hmm.
So how do I know that it's my friend?
That's great. That's a great question. I think there's two levels of this, and I don't know how technically.
So the first one is we're not solving it in that we're letting one of your existing social networks.
So you're delegating to the social network as the identity provider.
Yes.
So if the social network if
Is
one of those networks is
yes,
part of your
is
threat
in
model,
cahoots.
Now,
then
where we
we're
can
out
get
of luck.
where we can get more technical is that you can imagine cryptographic primitives to try to address some portion of that, right? Like maybe you trust them to tell you who this person is and the fact that you are friends with them, but maybe you don't trust them with the raw messages that are going over their network, right? And you can imagine doing some kind of cryptographic, encryption and decryption and signing and verifying to help deal with that.
And there's an alternative to use email if
Right.
you don't trust a social network. Right?
Okay,
So
sorry, what's that?
you can copy and paste these messages
Right.
into email or into whatever your preferred identity alternative is if you don't trust one of the ones that's there. So there's an option, but
Can we see what those messages look like for the manual verification? Or do you-
I think ultimately what
they look like a nice, ASCII binary
Yeah,
blob thing that you're going to copy and paste. Base 64 encoded, so it doesn't get too messed up and
yeah.
not the user experience that is prominent. Because I think we sort of are hoping that's a different demographic largely, right? Like the people who are going to be using this versus the people who are actually going to copy and paste. Once you're copying and pasting, you probably know what you're doing and are willing to go to a little bit more work. Cool.
Okay, so this might be a really basic question, but if I'm in China and Facebook and Google are already blocked, how do I connect to this proxy?
Yeah, so I mean, ultimately, Google and Facebook are obviously blocked in China. As we mentioned earlier, we're going to try to make it as easy as possible for, say, to engage the Chinese developer community to write support for their own social networks, which happen to span, beyond Chinese borders. And the same thing goes for any other country. I mean, there's going to be some subset of social networks that are going to work in any part of the world. And depending on what part of the world, these two may not be the most popular social networks that anybody's on anyway. If you look at a country like Russia or you look anywhere else, these things kind of vary. So to some extent, the world is bigger than the two of us can imagine it. The more that we can make it easier to engage third-party developers, I think the better off we'll be. But yes, eventually we imagine there'll be some developer community that will write support for some other social networks.
Man, all right, if I want to hook up together with a friend that's located in the United States, I gather that means that it could not be a secure network, unless I misunderstand some very basic point. However, I believe they have some secure networks in Sweden. I'm familiar with a couple of them. And if I wanted to hook up with my friend in Sweden, we'd be going across the cable under the Atlantic. Therefore, the communication to the secure network would be insecure. So, what is the best case scenario for using this?
So someone could monitor that cable, right? Someone can. So you're connecting to a friend in Sweden,
right.
Let's say, and we can imagine that someone is monitoring that cable or is monitoring that connection. And so the question is, what are they going to learn from that monitoring? So one thing they'll notice is that you are talking to your friend in Sweden.
What does you mean here?
Your IP address is sending messages and receiving messages to an IP address in Sweden.
Okay, that's a good
But
answer.
are they going to see what's inside of that? Well, it's encrypted. So hopefully, if we trust these encrypted primitives, they're not necessarily going to see the content of what's going through you and your friend. And importantly, that means they're not going to actually see the end destinations that you're getting to via your friend.
So if I really wanted to communicate securely with somebody in this room, and I found a fairly secure network and was able to hook up one, or even an ordinary, or somebody else in the room, it would be impossible for my email, is email something that I can send back and forth, and it would be going through this?
So there's a couple things. This isn't just for chat, right? So if you want secure chat, there are specific things. I guess I would probably point to CryptoCat or something of that nature that will just be for direct secure communication. And you would just use that as the way that you're getting your secure communication. What this is really meant for is probably a different use case. You can certainly get to your email through it or to whatever else. And this is going to protect from you to your email, to whatever that website is that has your email. This is going to make it harder for someone to connect those. But when you send your email, that email from your email account to someone else's, we're not touching that. So that still is going to potentially be insecure. And we're not like encrypting your actual email that you send. So that's a different problem, and that's why I'd say this isn't like specific to like we're going to make a secure communication thing. This is, I want to be able to get to these services that are not accessible where I am.
I see.
Or I want someone to not be able to see what I'm doing, who's on my local network.
In other words, if we could, even if we have an absolutely secure communication, we're sending it to Facebook, they're going to sell it to somebody else.
Exactly. So right. So it's exactly the same thing. Just because you're using this doesn't like mean that you aren't going to mess up on the internet. It just means that this first step we can give you some extra privacy.
So we talked earlier about Kaleidoscope, which was an earlier project, which was something like this, except you jumped from friend to friend to friend, so that by the time you got to the other end, you were anonymous.
Mm-hmm.
So do you see someone possibly building something like that on top of this?
You can imagine.
I mean, it's all open source. There's nothing to keep anybody from forking the project and doing any kind of modification with it. And to some extent, those are strategies that there's a bunch of other projects that are actually exploring what it means to deploy Kaleidoscope and how well does it perform, and whether it's useful in actually getting you access in times when you can't. But yes, I guess there were two parts of your question. Are there people doing Kaleidoscope? Yes, we are probably not one of them. And whether or not somebody can make variants of uProxy, that's actually, it's open source. That's one of the reasons why we make it open source.
I think we're probably going to put effort towards like having this be a first hop to Tor, as like probably would be earlier than doing just using the social network. The social network, as you do multiple hops, tends to be very stringy. People won't have that many friends, at least initially, and so you'll get probably a much better performance by using this to get out to some place where you can use Tor, and then using Tor for anonymity. That's probably something that that's a reasonable.
To some extent,
way
Kaleidoscope jumped ahead a little bit in terms of let's assume that your social network kind of indicates what your general assumptions of trust are in terms of your social network. Then the intuition there with Kaleidoscope is if I probably trust my friend of a friend more than I trust someone totally somewhere else on the network. I think this is a reasonable first step because I'm not even sure people trust their friends for a lot of things, and I think we need to figure that out first. Yeah.
The other thing is, as you get to those multiple hops, now there's sort of this question of what traffic is coming out of my computer. How am I responsible? What am I signing up for?
Right. I think we have two more.
Yeah.
You mentioned as a motivator, nations, censorship that's happening at a nationwide scale, and uProxy as a way that people who are visiting countries that have that kind of censorship to get around that censorship. But what about the case of people who live in those countries, for whom most of their friends are also people who live in these countries? Is the uProxy of any use to those folks?
That's a great question, and that's something we're actively pursuing. There's, we alluded very briefly to uProxy for cloud, and I think that's one step that we could potentially do this. So for example, in certain countries, it's quite common for your tech-savvy friend to be the one that sets up a VPN or proxy server in the cloud somewhere, and then hands out those username and passwords to their friends or through a forum or something like that. To some extent, I think that kind of mentality is something that we want to try to encode in uProxy for cloud, as in make it extremely easy, couple button clicks, enter your credit card information, we've deployed something for you, and then you can share that through the UI with your friends. It's like something...
Credit card information.
I didn't even know that was done.
To some extent, we're trying to just codify these access patterns that people are already trying to do in areas where they don't have friends. But yeah, you're right, that's a hard challenge.
I think the other thing was that the initial sort of motivation towards uProxy was the thought that a lot of people do have friends in other places. People study abroad enough that a lot of the people who are looking for access do know someone who's is or has been abroad and have that friendship.
China and Iran come to mind as countries that have different laws for businesses compared to individuals using the internet. So to answer your question, or to give maybe an idea, a suggestion, becoming friends with somebody corporate, and using their
Corporate connection.
corporate
The businesses might have issues with that.
Yeah.
I can
Well,
imagine.
but
They might.
The thing is that there are allowed to access these sites, but you as an individual are not.
Right.
Right. That's fair.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the structure of the communication that does actually pass through these identity providers, and what kind of linkages are created there, and if you've thought at all about how that interacts with the jurisdictional issues that this creates, right? So visiting online gaming sites is illegal in the U.S. If my friend in I don't know, Katie has access to it, and I rely on their network to get there, am I putting them at legal risk, or are they putting me at legal risk? And who knows that those connections have been made?
Yeah, I mean,
So there's a couple things. So one of the, I think you started by saying what is known by this identity provider.
Yeah.
So they know that I have started a connection to my friend. They don't know any of the specific sites that I've gone
But
to.
they know there is a uProxy connection.
They'll see a message. Potentially, that can be an indication that it started. They won't know how long it's lasted. So any subsequent traffic,
The message is identifiable as a uProxy invitation.
I think more likely than not, that's a safe assumption.
Yeah. It won't be like explicitly stated that way. So there's potentially deniability that you can argue, but probably there will be enough traces that they can sort of, it's a client that OAuth as a uProxy application with us.
Now, typically,
But
countries
they
are
can
not the type to make the use of proxies illegal, right? Like as you were mentioning earlier, proxies and VPNs are pretty common in businesses as well, just as a use case. I mean, sometimes in certain countries, it might be an indicator that you may,
I mean, we'll see. So the other thing is we are working on making it so that you can have the way that uProxy connects to the identity provider, rather than being as like an official application that is registered with them, as instead pretending to be a user typing messages into a box where they can't actually distinguish our access on them from a normal user. Like that's a direction that we're heading, because we think there will be sort of combative social networks that people want to use to find their friends that aren't necessarily happy about uProxy being enabled on them. So we want to have that, and in that case, we need them to not know that those messages are uProxy based. So.
You mentioned that you intend for this to be a really nice first hop into Tor.
Yeah.
If you're using, say, Chrome, and your uProxy friend is using Tor, will you still be able to get those messages such as like, oh, this Tor browser is out of date, or this is using a HTML canvas tag or something? Like
So the thought there is, so I guess, yeah, there's a couple thoughts there. One is both friends would still be using uProxy. And probably the way that this would end up happening is we would somehow get uProxy with a Tor browser bundle. Because just having uProxy have a checkbox that's like use Tor isn't an experience that's particularly good, because that's not something we can promise in terms of the anonymity guarantees. You really need a lot of other things off to be in a mode that Tor is appropriate. And so what that would be is you've got a Tor browser bundle, you're still getting all of that, but you can, if you're in a place where you can't actually access bridges directly, you would first make a uProxy connection, and then Tor would go through uProxy to the rest of the Tor network. So the friend wouldn't need any sort of Tor stuff. That seems like the most realistic way to do that.
All right, if there's no
Cool.
more questions, any more questions? Dave?
Last question to finish
this
us off.
I guess this is halfway to the question and comment. So you mentioned that practice that already exists of people in countries of censorship regimes setting up VPNs and giving around their password names and passwords. And we're proposing to codify this and with the help of a social network. My concern is, okay, now you've got this social network, just this, highly, this big database of, information of social connections that's probably, I'm sure, the censorship happy countries love to go through, or want to probably want me to eventually go through. And so now with uProxy, there's data in the social network about the use of uProxy. So am I correct to see here that the use of uProxy might introduce risk in that the fact that you're using this proxying is more widely known now? It sounds like something has already been raised, but does that make any sense at all?
So I guess
No, I mean, this is something that we were essentially was trying to answer a little bit earlier. It was related to your question, which is that I mean, yes, we want to hide the messages in terms of what you're actually saying over the wire, right? So it may not necessarily be that you know exactly what the uProxy messages are going across the wire, but at the end of the day, there are messages going across the social network that may or may not identify you as somebody using uProxy, and that's something that you probably want to take into account. Now, for those types of users where it's not just casual use, the copy and paste mechanism probably makes more sense for you, right?
I guess the other thing maybe that partially mitigates this is someone who's doing analysis on the social network already knows all of your friends, as opposed to just the ones that you're proxying.
Right.
So there's a lot more dangerous things that they can do with that full graph. So at the point that they're doing that, this is a small part of the risk that you're.
That's true.
All right, I guess another round of applause.